right. Welcome, everyone. And thank you for joining us today. A special thank you to Anthropocene Institute, not only for supporting this research, but also for hosting this webinar. So we here at Radiant Energy Group are joining you today to share the findings from our most recent polling of US attitudes towards clean energy, with a particular focus on nuclear power. This PACE survey is one of the most comprehensive examinations of public sentiment towards nuclear energy to date. And it's actually a global polling initiative, with the USA being one of more than 30 countries and regions that we survey. But the USA is a vast, complex, and influential country. And in light of the major election last year, we decided that it warranted a closer, more detailed examination. So for 2024, we surveyed 23 US states and treated each of them as if they were their own country, giving them the same level of analytical depth and density that we would typically devote to a full national poll. And this allowed us to look at state level differences that otherwise wouldn't be detected by a full USA national poll. For example, we see states like Colorado and Massachusetts that have historically been anti-nuclear may have populations that are warming to nuclear energy. And it allowed us to examine levels of support in Georgia and South Carolina, two states with recent nuclear construction experience, but very different outcomes. Due to budget constraints, we couldn't survey all 50 states this year, but in the 23 states selected, over 20,000 Americans were surveyed. Before we dive into the findings and how that happened, let me briefly introduce our team. I'm Madison Hilly. I'm a partner at Radiant Energy Group. Joining us in a little bit will be our managing director, Mark Nelson. And I'm about to turn it over to Rich Allington, who is the architect of the global and US PACE surveys. So Rich, before we sort of walk through the report and what the results say, can you explain a bit of the methodology behind the PACE survey? I think specifically people will be interested in why these 23 states and how much of America do they actually represent?
So we chose 23 states based on, we want to get a good understanding of all the swing states, as well as all the states that had lots of nuclear power plants. So in total, our 23 US states, within them, there are 78 operating nuclear reactors. So the majority of American nuclear power plants. And then there was other states that we included that either had large populations, albeit no nuclear reactors, and that helped get us up to 3/4 of the US public being represented in this survey. And then finally, we were sort of strategic with the choice of certain states where we thought there'd be an interesting story. States like Washington, where there's the Hanford nuclear waste site, Colorado and California, where there's sort of historic anti-nuclearism. So that sort of inspired our thinking of what these 23 US states would be. For each of these states, we took the same methodology as what we did with our global public opinion polling. So 1,000 respondents within each state. That group of respondents is representative by the mix of gender and age. So roughly 50-50 men and women for each state. And then the age bands will also be represented. And with this representative sample size of 1,000, it means that the accuracy that you can feel confident the data is showing is plus or minus 3%. Bit of further background, the survey is done with a professional polling agency called Savanta, and they put the survey out online for people to fill in. On our own website, we've done a dummy version of the survey for people to fill in so that they can take the survey themselves and understand how it works. And that's on our website at the bottom of the web page, showing all of the US polling data. So we do welcome people to play along with the survey, get a, see how your answers compare to those of the US public, and to give us feedback on how you think the survey can be improved for the future.
I also think it's not to steal a cool your thunder, but there's also the ability to search your zip code. So if you are in a state that was one of the 23 that was surveyed, you can see if someone from your zip code got surveyed and what they say. It's been very interesting to see. I did a 1 hour deep dive on that a couple nights ago, and it was very, very fascinating.
We'll get to that and let people put a few fun ones in. For now, though, I will share screen and we can go through some of the highlights from the report. So first off, just the very high level, do you support or oppose nuclear, and how that looks across all the states? Right at the top, we see in Georgia, where the latest nuclear power plant has started in the US, we've got the highest net support. There, 43% support and only 25% oppose. At the bottom, we have the sort of least nuclear supportive state of West Virginia, where there's around a third of the public in favor and a third against. The thing that stuck out for me is that there's not a huge amount of variation between states compared to what we see in our global poll. In our global poll, at the top end, you've got countries like Poland and Norway, where they're super pro-nuclear. And then on the bottom end, there's countries like Japan and Spain, where there's more opposition than support. But across states, the public opinion is fairly similar. And it's encouraging to see that across these 23 states, there's on average 1.5 times more Americans supporting nuclear than opposing it. If we
Quickly
go to
before
the
we move
next,
on, Rich, sorry.
yeah,
What stuck out to me is that South Carolina is still pretty high up on this list. So for those who don't know, there were reactors, AP1000 reactors under construction in South Carolina, and the project ultimately failed and it ended up bankrupting the utility. And yet we see pretty high net support for nuclear. So it's hard to say with a poll, maybe South Carolina would have been an outlier in super high nuclear support, and the VC Summer project actually reduced it to this level. But it's encouraging to maybe see that even projects like that fail aren't necessarily enough to deter people from recognizing the need or perhaps wanting nuclear for their state.
and later we'll build on that. And we asked the question, are you concerned about how long it takes to build nuclear? And the two of the states with the highest concern were Georgia and South Carolina, which I thought was really interesting. These two states, they've got the lived experience of nuclear delays or cancellations. But even with that concern for delays, there's high support. And that, yeah, interesting story. The next chart I wanted to show was around what we're calling climate action skeptics. So we asked people, are you concerned about climate change or not? Across the US, there was a share that were not concerned about climate change. And we looked just at those people that were not concerned about climate change. What type of energy had the highest net support? And overwhelmingly, across the states, nuclear came out on top. Nuclear in pink. Second was either gas with carbon capture if you're a Republican voter, or wind and solar if you're a Democratic voter. And I think what that tells me is, if you're looking to build the 2050 net zero grid in the US, you've got to be cautious of potential political parties, people with power coming in and tearing down a lot of progress that's been made. And therefore, a way to defend against that would be to build what the climate action skeptics like the most. So nuclear can be that insurance option for the US to help it reach its 2050 net zero goals, while still appealing to the anti-net zero climate action skeptics. The third chart is around preference, and across the US, nuclear is the second most preferred clean energy option after large-scale solar. And then the fourth chart here is around views on whether we keep nuclear in the state, whether we build more, and whether we build more with subsidy. And here it's encouraging to see that across most states, there's 3 times more people that want to keep using nuclear than to tear it down, and as many as 2 times as many wanting it to be built than phased out. Next, going on to political differences. There's often been talk that politically nuclear has bipartisan support. We were interested to see how that looks at a public level. And indeed, we see the gap between what Democratic voters in blue here and Republican voters in red think about nuclear is very small compared to that of onshore wind and large-scale solar. It is worth noting still, there is more support amongst Republicans, or comparable support amongst Republicans, for onshore wind and large-scale solar. It's just that the gap is smaller for nuclear energy. And that's important. Nuclear operates on long-term timeframes. It needs to have consistent policy, or benefits on consistent policy over 10 years plus. And therefore, if the gap in political support is small amongst the public, as well as the voted politicians, that's encouraging for the nuclear industry. The second comparison between what Republican and Democratic voters think was on what energy attributes they want to see in their energy. And broadly, people from both sides of the spectrum agree on most things. Reliability often comes up top with health and safety. The one thing where there was big difference was on climate change. And there we saw the biggest divide, political divide. And I think, one way of thinking about it differently is while Republicans didn't see tackling climate change as a key criteria for them, what they did see was the importance of energy self-sufficiency and the importance of the health and safety side of energy, so lower air pollution. And therefore, when speaking about clean energy options to the different political parties, it's worth taking this into account. What are the messages that most appeal to different sides of the political spectrum?
So that's interesting when you say, the message, which we do hear a lot in America, that nuclear is one of the only bipartisan issues. It's not necessarily talking about public sentiment. It's talking about, at the state and federal level, what are legislators voting on? What are they willing to act on? And maybe some of these attributes explain why Democratic lawmakers are choosing to support nuclear more so than maybe they're feeling the pressure from their constituents.
Yeah. Next set of graphs around different attributes of nuclear. So we asked about views on reliability, the cost of nuclear, the safety, the cleanliness. And here are 3 charts that sort of stuck out to us. So first was on reliability. Broadly, across all US states, there's around 3/4 of the public that sees nuclear as reliable. And views on wind and solar are up there as well, as they're also seen as reliable. But worth noticing, there's a huge difference between what Republicans and Democratic voters see as reliable for wind and solar, whereby Republicans view nuclear as the most reliable energy source ahead of wind and solar. Amongst Democratic voters, it's the opposite. And I think what that struck us is that there's maybe a different perception of what the word reliable means, depending on who you are. And the word reliable can mean different things to different people. To some people, it means capacity factor, or not turning off when the wind stops blowing or the sun stops shining. But for other people, it might mean uptime, like the solar panels on my roof. They've never stopped working. They're always able to work if the sun was shining. So it's important to understand a survey can be interpreted in different ways by different people. Next, we asked about whether people see different energy sources as producing no carbon emissions or low carbon emissions. And here, nuclear is seen as by only a third of Americans as producing low to no carbon emissions. And this struck us as a clear area where the nuclear industry could improve its communications. We see often that climate change is important to the electorate, and therefore, if the public is able to see nuclear as low emissions, it might help public support. Finally, was a set of questions around what are people concerned about? Waste management, health and safety, and the time it takes to build. On the right here, you see, as mentioned earlier, Georgia and South Carolina were the most concerned about the time it takes to build nuclear, despite having high level of support. The other states we have highlighted here are in the middle. We've got Pennsylvania, where the 3 Mile incident happened. And it was interesting to see that their concern for safety isn't necessarily that different from the other states. Similarly, on the waste management side, in Nevada, there's the Deep Geological Repository being considered. In Washington, the Hanford site. And despite that, the level of concern was 79 and 82%, which very similar to all the other states.
I also think it's interesting to see New York on the top of that waste management list. I think when we think of nuclear waste, we're thinking of the spent fuel in the casks, but talking about the Indian Point around that public discussion was wastewater, and actually Riverkeeper, the local NGO, was talking about nuclear waste being released into the water. So that's something also to keep top of mind when we're talking about nuclear comms. It's not always what we immediately associate with waste. There are all sorts of ways that people interpret these questions or are thinking about nuclear.
The next set of graphs is sort of a compilation of all the different demographic splits within these 23,000 respondents we looked at, and understanding which demographics showed the largest division. And globally, if we take a step back, globally, it's actually left-right political divide, closely followed by gender, that are the most divisive demographic splits for nuclear support. In America, though, it's slightly different. At the very top is views on how concerned the public is about climate, where those that are not at all concerned are the most supportive, and those very concerned are the least supportive. And household income, which is particularly interesting. But in America, households with the highest income are the most supportive of nuclear's use. But also we see in third place is the gender divide, which is consistent in most countries. Here we have 29, amongst men, there's 29% net support for nuclear, and amongst women, there's more people opposing nuclear than supporting it. And what this tells us is, where should communication be focused? Who isn't being heard whose concerns aren't being heard properly by the nuclear industry? And yeah, the place to look will be sort of the lower earners, those that are most concerned about climate change, women, and yeah, those that are not 65 and over. That seems to be a strong outlier, which we see in most countries, that the sort of the much older side to demographics are the more supported ones. Finally, as was mentioned to earlier, we've got this fun, I like to call it the bubble gum wall, having visited Seattle, where they've got the chewing gum wall. We thought all the colors would be fun. And if you hover your mouse over, you can see what different people said about nuclear energy across the 23 states that we surveyed. So for example, I've saved one that I thought was quite nice earlier in Illinois, where a 23-year-old man from Illinois with a zip code 60612 said, It isn't the perfect solution, but it's the best short-term solution. And we're just about out of time as a species to figure it out before we suffocate in our own industrial emissions. Solar and wind are on their way, but they're not there yet. And nuclear is the only proven source of energy that can provide more than we need and be clean and safe if operated properly. So a fun anecdote from a real life survey respondent. We do encourage you to play around with this tool, type in your zip code, see what people in your area think. Not all zip codes will feature, but hopefully yours will. The other charts we have on this page are broken down by congressional district and by county in terms of views on the share of the public that wants nuclear to be built, the preferred clean energy source, and the level of net support for nuclear energy. So, if we take this one and we zoom in on the Chicago area, Illinois area, where there's lots of nuclear power plants, it's interesting to see Byron has strong net support nearby, and so do Dresden and yeah, LaSalle. Worth noting with these maps of the US, the sample size is incredibly small. Here in this county, there's only 10 respondents. Therefore, do take the color coding with a large grain of salt. They're indicative and a fun, playful map. And then finally, on our website, you'll see at the bottom, there's the survey that you can fill in yourself if you want to see how our survey is run. And then we've also got a link to the PDF to the report and, crucially, the Excel database, which has far more lines of data than anyone could read, but is a great tool for anyone looking to answer their questions and dig into the data a bit more.
Yeah, so I saw someone's already asking if these are publicly available, and the answer is yes, all on our website. If you go to radiantenergygroup.com and click on the US PACE report, all of these interactive charts are there, as well as the zip code finder and that dummy survey that you can take to see what people are actually being asked to answer.
Thanks, Mike, for sharing. Should we open up to questions?
Yeah, people just want to start, and we can just do some deep dives on these if people are interested. Rich, I believe you already mentioned this, but the polling margin of error on the presented numbers, you said plus minus 3%?
Yeah, 3%. And that's when there's 1,000 respondents in a state. If we're looking at all the women, for example, in the survey, where there'll be more than 10,000 women, the margin will be smaller because there was a larger number of respondents. Yeah.
And then
One,
oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, sort of related to that, there was another recent Gallup poll that showed 61% support for nuclear in the US. How does that compare with US PACE? And if it's different, can it be explained by the margin of error? And if not, what do we think? It's always hard to say, it's polling, but what do you suspect might explain those differences?
Yeah, the recent Gallup poll was much more positive for the nuclear industry. Yeah, 61% is higher than the 30 to 40% that we've been seeing. I think there's two reasons for that. One is the Gallup polling was done the week of Sierra Week. And midway through the polling, there was the announcement that large energy users, including Google and Meta, supported triple nuclear. And there's the potential that led to good news stories that changed public opinion that week. The other key difference that appears is in our survey, we asked people what they think about nuclear, as well as wind, solar, and other clean energy options. And when people are asked about that mix of clean energy options, often they don't put as higher support for nuclear, given that they've already clicked support for the other energy options. And that's something that we and Anne Visconti, with her amazing survey, have seen in the data. Whereas the Gallup poll, there it just asked about nuclear as far as we can see, and therefore that often leads to higher levels of support.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess that makes sense when it's in combination, or you're asking compared to other energy technologies, maybe some preferences end up affecting what you would say if you were just asked in isolation. Can you go, Rich, to the chart on reliability or the energy attributes being questioned? The question is, I have a question about the reliability numbers and I'm feeling confused. Does everyone think solar and wind are more reliable than gas and biomass?
Yes, yes. So if we just look at Pennsylvania here, we see amongst those in Pennsylvania, 75% of the public see large-scale solar farms as reliable. In second place, nuclear with 73%, and then onshore wind. And then biomass and gas with carbon capture, around half of people from Pennsylvania see those as reliable. It's worth noting when asking about gas with carbon capture and biomass from trees, often, and we see it around the world, it's more likely people answer don't know, because they're not energy sources that are spoken about as much, and therefore people aren't as confident in their understanding. And that will have contributed to why those numbers are lower in terms of sort of perceived reliability.
Wow, that is still surprising. Maybe the gas, maybe the carbon capture aspect, people are not, I share in the surprise that that is not seen as more reliable and is typically on the lower end of that spectrum.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
okay, question about West Virginia. Were there any indicators among responses as to why West Virginia was so opposed? Did you see any similar trends among other states that are considering lifting nuclear bans or recently did so?
I have to admit, I can't remember West Virginia in particular. I'd have to dig through the large Excel data table to remind myself how West Virginia differentiated itself to all the other states.
Yeah, I think.
I can answer that.
Oh, go
Hey,
ahead.
Maddie.
Hey, Mark.
Sorry, everybody on the webinar. I'm a little bit late. So West Virginia has never had a nuclear industry. West Virginia didn't even have large infrastructure projects like Kentucky did that were part of the Manhattan Project. So no familiarity with nuclear, no built-in constituency for nuclear, a coal industry that has been dying for a really long time. We were quite astonished, though, with the low level of support for nuclear among West Virginia, one of the lowest we've seen anywhere in the country, considering the other things that typically were associated with support for nuclear. For example, a strongly conservative electorate, or in the case of men, lower concern for climate change. It was therefore quite astonishing to see how little West Virginians supported nuclear, which brings us to an interesting form of the paradox that we saw for other states, which is if we're seeing a bunch of young enthusiasm for nuclear, but our polling shows that young people aren't so much for nuclear. And if we know that a lot of the most vicious and successful anti-nuclear activists in the history of nuclear power were in the older generation, and if we know that people who like fossil fuels and are right-wing and are men tend to like nuclear, then what does it mean that our polling in states like West Virginia show such a low affinity for the technology? Especially considering, as the question noted, West Virginia just legalized nuclear. I'll tell you that the West Virginia nuclear conversation has just barely begun. Just 12, 24 months ago, in the context of what is West Virginia going to do now that coal is going away. As much as Trump and his administration may be interested in trying to support coal, there's only so much you can do. Even if you kept running coal plants in West Virginia, a lot of that coal is probably going to be shipped in from lower cost coal producing states like Wyoming. So what this says to us is that there are very intense pro-nuclear sentiments among small groups of leadership in different populations. For example, among right-wing legislators in West Virginia looking for the next big opportunity, energy opportunity for their state on one hand, and among some of the young people who have been the most vocal leaders on climate in their communities, their schools. That's going to be the same groups that are pushing ahead, but are not yet numerically strong enough to show up in our polling. The leadership is there, but we expect to see the polling to take some time for those populations. And for example, for West Virginia, and even when it turns towards nuclear energy, for those polling results to be seen in our studies.
Mark, would you say that that's a similar story for Colorado, a state that also has very limited experience for nuclear and might be exploring legislation due to very active parties, but is still lagging in public sentiment? Do you think there's a difference between the two, or major difference, I should say?
I think Colorado is a great example. Really committed vanguard, a volunteer vanguard, pro-nuclear vanguard, assembling themselves on WhatsApp and in real life in Denver next to the Capitol building, fought for and won pro-nuclear victories in the Capitol building. I mean, they just walked straight down the street into their Capitol, but it organized themselves on WhatsApp and online. This is a group of a few dozen people. That's not a big enough amount to show up in polling. Those are leaders among segments that are concerned with climate, concerned with energy stability and security. And they've come together, putting aside all other demographic differences to fight for nuclear, but it's still a relatively small group of extremely committed people. So I think that the Colorado example is just perfect. A big victory that was a big spearheaded by a small number of committed activists. The same thing that originally got nuclear bans around the country, even though, as our polling data now clearly shows, it's the same generation that got nuclear banned in a lot of the biggest states in the country that most supports nuclear today.
I'd add to that, what we see in the data is, looking at Colorado, there's almost 2 times more people strongly supporting nuclear than strongly opposing. And while overall support and opposition is similar, most of the Colorado opposition tend to oppose, whereas most of Colorado support is strongly support. And that speaks to, yeah, there's more emphasis behind the pro-nuclear side of the debate. I see Guido's question in the chat. Is there any common pattern to areas with heavy anti-nuclear views? There's one thing that stood out to me, which was we asked the question, what makes the fuel of nuclear electricity? Is it uranium? Is it oxygen? Is it a dozen other wrong answers? And what stood out was the states that were often right were the sort of more historically anti-nuclear states, like New York and Colorado and Massachusetts. And that seemed really interesting. Here, there's states where people had done their research and understood how nuclear energy works, or at least what the fuel was to nuclear, but still stood by their views on nuclear. So, you know, that doesn't directly answer the question, but that was an interesting thing that stood out to me, that you sort of unified some of the more historically anti-nuclear states.
I'm seeing a question here about the gender gap. The gender disparity is mind-boggling. What do you think is the root cause for it? So with polling, you know, that this is not, we can't answer it with this polling. However, we can say what it isn't. It can't be fully explained by party affiliation. We see that Republican women are less supportive of nuclear than Democratic voting men. It can't be explained really by any of the other demographics that we have tested for either, or we surveyed either. There has been some research done on this issue previously, because this gender gap in nuclear is not new. A lot of people, when I posted about these findings online, said, oh, women just know less about nuclear, or women are less STEM inclined than men. And that would be called the knowledge gap hypothesis, basically that women know less about technology, and specifically nuclear technology, and therefore are less supportive. And if that gap were closed, so too would the public opinion gap. However, we actually see the same gap in support among equally educated segments of the population, not in this poll specifically, but in previous studies. They even, all the way up to nuclear physicists and nuclear engineers, there is a major gap in support between men and women. So it's definitely something that deserves further inquiry, because, you know, it to me, it seems obvious. It's 50% of the population. And so if 50% of the public is not on board, no project, no matter how great, is fully immune to public sentiment. And we've seen historically major backlash, and anti-nuclear campaigns actually predominantly led by women. So it's something that the industry needs to take seriously, advocates need to take seriously, and research should take seriously to continue to get to the bottom of it, and figure out how concerns can be better addressed.
There's one hypothesis I'd heard as well, which is around sort of the Myers-Briggs sets of, personality types. And there's certain personality types that are stronger amongst women than amongst men. And what you would expect the personality types men to have are the ones that support nuclear the most. And therefore, I think sadly, we don't have data in our survey. We don't ask about personality types. But that if the research was done, it could suggest, communicating about nuclear in a way that represents that chimes better with those personality types that are most opposed would work. So more of the testing my Myers-Briggs knowledge, but more of the feeling versus thinking sort of spectrum.
I also think I've seen some hypotheses based on risk comfortability, basically that women are far more sensitive to tail risk than men are. And so if all you ever hear about nuclear, especially in the last 2 decades, is the tail risk accidents, namely Fukushima, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and you don't actually, we all know how played up those are, and that there are mass misunderstandings amongst the public of the actual health and public safety risks that those pose. So if you think, okay, but in a worst case scenario, large swath of Europe is uninhabitable for a decade or two, or whatever is, the HBO show told you, then I could absolutely understand that lowering support. But again, these are all hypotheses. These are not tested. And I think that more research absolutely should go into further exploring this. And different demographic, did you look at age within the finding that those who are most concerned about climate change are least supportive of nuclear?
Yes, and let me find, I think if I share screen. So this is me sharing the screen, a view of the PDF of the report. So here we've got a view of with age, sort of women and men. And here, we see men get more supportive for nuclear with age. Women's support for nuclear doesn't seem to appear to change much with age. And then it doesn't directly answer the question, but if we were to look at the data in more depth, we would be able to get the answer. But what we see amongst people that self-identify as members of environmental groups in dark green, we see that these members of environmental groups are the more supportive bunch in the under 45-year-old category. But then in the older than 45-year-old category, there it's the non-members, the general public, that have the high level of support. But I do like the question and keen to pursue that offline by looking into the data if Lisa wants to reach out.
Let's see. If you have historical data, what does that tell you about how attitudes towards nuclear may be shifting and the prospects for new nuclear in the US?
I think that it
One,
might be good. Sorry, Maddie, Rich. I think it might be good to almost pair this question with the one below. Very interesting and deep question. Rich, comment first on the historical data, because obviously you saw, I think many of us on this webinar might have seen a huge number of headlines about the most recent Gallup poll data saying the record high for support for nuclear. And people have asked us, hey, what does the radiant data say in the historical data? Want to comment on that, Rich?
Yeah. So we don't have the same wealth of historical data that Gallup does. Well, Gallup saw that rise in support since since 2 years ago for theirs. And it'll come out in the global polling. We've actually seen a decline in support, and that surprised us a bit. But when we looked at Gallup's historic data, what we saw is in periods around elections in the past, there has been more opposition for nuclear. And the way we sort of internalized that, thought about it, is as there's more uncertainty with a potential change in who's in government, who's in power, people's level of general concern goes up. They don't know what the future of nuclear would be like in their country. They don't know what the future of their country will be. And therefore that might contribute to more people answering simply don't know or neither support nor oppose, which leads to lower overall support. So yeah, that's what we're seeing in the US, and that's why we think support has dropped slightly in the US.
So that brings us to the next part of what I wanted to make a single conversation. There's a statement, there's somebody asking on our poll, anonymous, which we absolutely respect. How is this data going to be used? Is this going to be weaponized? Are we trying to tell people to build nuclear in specific communities? Are we trying to go out and educate in those communities? I will tell you the way I see the Radiant Energy Group data. First of all, it's fascinating, and I want to know. I want to see the data behind it. Hundreds of anecdotes we get per year when we are asked to speak or consult on nuclear energy projects or on other energy projects. But in terms of how our data is used, this is directed, from my point of view, this is directed at the nuclear energy industry, saying to them, how are you appreciated? We're not telling them where they ought to go or how they ought to do their business. But I did want to challenge an aspect of this otherwise very good question, which is that nuclear is traditionally built in underprivileged or minority communities. That is just strictly not the case. And in fact, once a nuclear plant exists somewhere, it tends to get wealthier than the surrounding areas. In the United States, typically, nuclear plants are in extremely white areas of the parts of the country that don't see a lot of immigration, parts of the country that maybe didn't have a lot of diversity in the first place. And although the jobs at nuclear plants are extremely well paid, very well paid, especially considering the rural areas they're often sitting in, it's just not the case that is going to be either a huge advantage or oppression for people of color or underrepresented communities. I can tell you also that there are very few nuclear plants in the US that are on tribal land. It's not zero. So one of the most famous examples would be up in Minnesota. There's a nuclear plant next to a casino on a tribal nation, and that's something that's created difficult relations between the casino and the tribe that runs it and the nuclear plant itself. So those are issues that do have to be looked at. But traditionally, for better or worse, sovereign nations and reservations and nuclear plants have not been particularly close together. And whether that should be attacked because you say people need the advantage of the jobs and the wealth and tax revenue from nuclear plants, or people turn it around and say, well, no, you should never build a nuclear plant there because that's an oppressive technology and people don't want it. Our polling data finds that some of the very sparsely populated, very high percentage Native American areas indeed do not want a nuclear plant in that region. And for various reasons, that well up there, it's not probably going to be done. I know that in some states, like in Oklahoma, there's an immense amount of hate and opposition to, say, foreign energy companies coming in and running over land rights in Indian tribal nations, putting up wind farms. That has a horrible reputation in Oklahoma is one example, but you almost never see the same people saying, are nuclear plants just going to be in oppressed areas? You almost never see them say, well, we're also really upset when wind turbines are put up and tribes don't consent. So just to say there needs to be a little bit of balanced understanding that because people go into a question like that, assuming that nuclear is bad and is oppressive, they assume that it must be built in a way that's bad. And then it's kind of a shocker sometimes to learn that actually the nuclear plants tend to be very popular among the communities that are living around them over 40 years, because almost by definition, if you weren't happy, you have left. To finally answer the question of where do we think nuclear plants are going to be built, the first and the obvious answer in most places is right at the existing nuclear plant. Obviously, if a community lives and works around a nuclear plant, that's a good sign that they might not necessarily oppose, or even they might support adding more units at the existing nuclear plant. In the West, for better or worse, much of the planning that's going into nuclear in the future has been focused on putting nuclear where nuclear already is. There are visions of, say, small modular reactors that could conceivably go closer into cities that don't already have nuclear, or deeper into population centers because they have a lower evacuation range. It remains to be seen how that will work. I would think that because a lot of the enthusiasm among nuclear does appear to be in elite groups, it raises the chance that nuclear is going to be in richer areas. So it will be very interesting for those who say that nuclear has been built, often without evidence, that nuclear energy has been built in areas that are underprivileged or oppressed. How will that message change when it appears that the richest communities are going to get more nuclear power? I'm not sure, but I can't wait to see the results of that conversation.
I'm going to jump to and similarly combine two questions, David and Carl's. David asked, could perceived association between nuclear and radioactivity and women's personal interest in reproductive health explain gender opinion differences? I'll be honest, I recently just gave birth to my second daughter. So as a mother, there are things that I know rationally in my head that still worried me throughout pregnancy, or I questioned myself or had to really dive into the scientific literature to make sure I was doing the right thing. I think it is absolutely possible that the correct amount of paranoia, I'm not suggesting that it's irrational. You would do anything to protect your baby, can make you far more risk averse and even question what you think you already know to make sure you're doing the right thing. So then how does that relate to changing public sentiment about nuclear energy? I'd say most people that I engage with on nuclear don't have a vision or a visual of nuclear waste, of a nuclear plant in reality, in nature, in next to a city. Or worse, they have a vision of nuclear and they got it from HBO's Chernobyl or The Simpsons or some other fictional nuclear. And so I find that just showing pictures of an actual waste cast or of Diablo Canyon, just an absolutely gorgeous nuclear power plant, or some of, even not the power plant, sometimes when we toured the Byron nuclear plant in Illinois, they were talking about how just that morning there were a bunch of baby fawn outside the plant and they have a photographer capture that. And I said, where are those pictures? And they said, well, we don't post them. And so I asked if I could get them because those are the exact types of things like, yeah, look at these cute animals that just coexist right next to this boring old plant. It's just concrete. And I think that has a way of relaxing people because it replaces imaginary or nightmarish images of nuclear with just worst case, it's boring. Best case scenario, it just looks beautiful. You see the people who are operating the plant and they look exactly like your neighbors. You know, with respect to the previous question, I think the putting my baby bump against the cask of melted core from 3 Mile Island at INL ruffled some feathers, but it showed that I don't think anyone thinks, wow, a mom would really put her baby in danger. Most women know, oh, that must mean it's incredibly safe. And, it was a great conversation starter. So having those conversations and just instead of being ready with, I mean, certainly be educated if you want to educate someone, but just having the pictures is almost more important, I find, than having just spewing facts at someone until you think that they're inundated with enough to make their own decision.
And on the data side to that, we do ask the question, of this list of 10 different environmental concerns, which are you most worried about? With one of the options being radiation. And men and women are as likely to select radiation as a concern. And it's only about 10% of Americans, from memory, that are concerned about radiation in their top 3 concerns. And the same goes for health and safety. There's not a huge amount of difference between men's and women's concern for that either. And then, earlier we showed the demographic split. And while there was a very large divide between what men and women thought about nuclear, between people that were parents of under 18-year-olds and those that weren't, we were amazed to see how tiny the split was. There didn't seem to be any real difference between being a parent and not in how supportive you were for nuclear.
Did you differentiate between, support for large reactors versus some of the more tech company supported on-site small nuclear?
We did not. Just today, Rich, if I can comment, today I got several people asking me, they saw the data and they said, wait, are you differentiating among reactors? We did not. And some of the most interesting feedback we've gotten from folks in the nuclear industry about this report is, why did you choose that technology for your study? Why did you choose that technology? Why did you call it onshore wind, not offshore wind? Why did you call it large scale photovoltaic, not rooftop? And I think the way we pick these technologies, because it was going to be imperfect either way. Even carbon capture and sequestration with gas was a little bit of a push for us. And it's because we see these as broadly comparable energy options in a real grid in most countries. In other words, offshore wind is only going to be something that makes sense to ask countries that have offshore wind potential. It's not all of them. And boy, if there's any industry that's starting to make nuclear look good in terms of actual cost versus value, it's offshore wind. For example, Jesse Jenkins is a friend to any low carbon energy that can get the job done. He recently said something that I thought was quite extreme, which was that why are we even bothering with offshore wind in New England when it's as expensive as Vogtle without the reliability? So we wanted to put actual reasonable policy options in one place. Similarly, there are so many people that think of solar as the panel on their rooftop, when we are very far away from that being able to actually take care of industrial electricity supplies and do large scale decarbonization. It's not useless. And some countries like Australia are really betting that people are going to keep demanding it. So they're going to have to keep supporting it. So they're going to have to build a grid around it, damn the costs and damn the risks. They're just going to do it. What we're saying is, if you're telling a government that would need to intervene to make sure that a giant amount of wind or a giant amount of solar or nuclear, which may be a small land footprint, but a huge amount of power. These are state-involved projects, regardless of what economic system we're talking about here. The politics will be involved, and we wanted this to be some sort of guide of not voting intention itself. I mean, we ask voting intention, right? That's not the same thing as asking about the energy source, but we wanted this poll to be as close as possible to what people might be asking from their politicians or telling their politicians they want to see. And rooftop solar seems to be independent of whether it's good or bad for a grid. If people want it, they're going to demand it. If there's a push for it, it's going to happen. There's very little that can be done to stop it or to start it. It's just part of the culture. But the giant industrial scale energy projects that are done for utilities and on a utility scale, those are the technologies we wanted to put together. All of that was framing this answer about, did you differentiate nuclear? We did not. We may do that on future studies or even one-off studies since we do an annual poll now at very high resolution in a lot of countries, and we may end up doing some frequency of this national poll in the United States, it gives us a basis to do an additional poll as long as the methodology is relatively the same, as in we use the same service that surveys the same population, and we just check to see, and we can use it as sort of a calibration sandwich around a special topic poll and see that if we ask differentiating questions about different nuclear on a specific nuclear poll, does that fit in with numbers that we're seeing on the broader polls before and after? And we may do special sample subject polls for if we have either clients that want it, and those clients may be a group like Anthropocene Institute where they have a very specific question they want to test. And if we keep as much as possible the same between our really high level, or not high level, but our survey that we've put in this format and we've now done around the world, we put a few $100,000 into this polling. We are quite committed to its structure, though of course always open to different ideas. We will do special topic surveys where we try to interlace that data and calibrate what we're seeing on the special topics against what we've seen on the broader comparison of these energy sources, which again, we've chosen for their utility scale sort of semi-interoperability.
There is other polling on different words used to describe nuclear. I think Potential Energy Coalition did some useful polling a couple of years ago. What I thought was interesting is small modular reactors actually polled quite poorly compared to just nuclear energy. And their rationale was it sounded a bit too scientific, a bit too non-human, alien, and that put people off. By contrast, what polls well is terms like advanced nuclear, because there it's the word advanced that people think of as the sort of the positive. So yeah, I think that's, yeah. And as the years go on, decades go by, there will always be new terms that come into use. And we wanted a poll that would control against that, that would be consistent throughout. This, at the moment, it might be small modular reactors. Next, it might be Gen 4 or Gen 5 reactors. And we wanted a term that could stand the test of time. I see the final question from Carl is, do you see differences in support on an ethnic basis? With regard, I assume sort of ethnicity and race is what you mean by that. And I will share screen. Again, this is in the PDF of the report. So what we have here is different ethnicities and races here. And then on the x-axis is net support. So the further you are right, the more supporters and fewer opposers you have. And then on the left, the opposite, the more opposition there is. What was interesting is broadly those with the highest support are white demographics and Asian demographics. We had a very small sample size, therefore it's not shown in this, but across the country, Hawaii, natives from Hawaii seem to also have a high level of support. The other interesting thing is amongst those different demographics, racial demographics, there's more division amongst white and Native American groups than amongst Black, Hispanic or Asian groups, where there's a lot more consensus, shall we say, between what men and women think. A similar view can be seen by political allegiances. Again, there's a large gap between what white Democrats and white Republicans think on nuclear energy. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, we appear to be top of the hour, and sorry everybody for coming late. Had a event I had to run out from to make it to here. Thank you so much, Maddie, for your moderating. Thanks, Rich, for just leading this outstanding study. And I hope that this is just the very beginning of conversations. Those on this call who are interested in more detailed data, or maybe it's data specific to a region that you're working in, or maybe if you have questions or concerns about our methodology, or you want to help us with the, call it the next stage of this research, which is allowing people to say at the end of the survey, yes, I would want to be contacted. I want to give my mind, or I want to find out why these people were asking these questions. This was interesting. The amount of care that so many of our respondents, of our 23,000 respondents, put into their open dialogue box indicates a hunger for a conversation on these topics. And we are going to work with the group we do the polling with to see what's possible in terms of allowing people to connect with us after they've gone through this, rigorous 5, 10, 15-minute chunk of their lives that may be getting them thinking about things they've never thought about before explicitly. If you're interested in working with us on that stage of the research after this polling, please, of course, get in touch or reach out to the Anthropocene Institute. I also want to give an absolutely huge thanks to the Anthropocene Institute for their support of this research and their promotion of the idea of seeing what people think about nuclear energy.
All right. Thanks,
Great.
everyone.